It was just after 7 p.m. when the maitre d', at the most exclusive rooftop restaurant in New York, escorted billionaire Landon Cross to his private corner table. The skyline glowed behind him, casting a golden halo around his silver hair. He was a man who had it all: wealth, power, recognition. But tonight, none of that would matter. He had come to celebrate the launch of his latest philanthropic venture, a media campaign centered on bridging economic divides. Cameras waited for him outside. His PR team hovered nearby. Every detail had been arranged for the perfect photo op. But as he adjusted his cufflinks and gave the signal to begin the toast, a soft voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir, can I ask you something?" The voice was quiet, almost shy. He turned, annoyed at first, until he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. Her curly hair was tied into neat little buns, her oversized coat dwarfed her small frame, and her sneakers were worn from overuse. She clutched a small paper in her hand, something scribbled in crayon. And though she looked a bit out of place, her eyes held a clarity that froze the entire table. The cameras stopped clicking. The waiters halted. Even Landon found himself speechless. He forced a polite smile. "Of course, young lady," he said, amused. "What's your question?" She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do people like me never get to eat in places like this?" Silence. Not the staged, expectant kind his team loved to orchestrate, this was the heavy kind. The kind that suffocated. Landon blinked. For the first time that evening, he had no words. His PR manager looked horrified. One of the guests coughed. A reporter began quietly filming on her phone. But the girl wasn't finished. She held up her paper. "This is a drawing of my mom's dream restaurant. She works 3 jobs. She says someday we'll eat somewhere like this, but I don't think she believes it anymore." Landon looked down at the crayon-sketched menu. It was simple. Pancakes. Juice. "No yelling" written in a bubble above a smiling waiter. His hands trembled slightly as he took it from her. That's when it hit him. Everything he claimed to be fixing, he had never truly seen. For a long moment, Landon Cross just stood there, a billionaire in a $1,000 suit, holding a crayon drawing from a child who had just shattered his illusion of impact. He slowly knelt down to meet her eye level, something he hadn't done with anyone in years. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Ari," she replied. "My mom says it means lion." Landon smiled faintly. "That fits." Around them, the elite guests were growing restless. Whispers spread across the room like ripples. Some were annoyed. Others uncomfortable. A few glanced toward the exits, unsure whether they were witnessing a publicity disaster, or something far more real. Ari looked around and asked the question that changed everything. "Why do rich people act like we don't exist?" She didn't say it with anger. It was pure curiosity, the kind only a child could deliver without judgment. That's what made it hurt more. Landon's throat tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. Because in that moment, he realized he had spent his life building walls disguised as causes. Sure, he'd written checks. Posed for magazine covers. Built scholarship programs with his name on every building. But none of that had brought Ari, or her mom, a seat at this table. "I don't know," he finally said. "But I think I've been part of the problem." A gasp escaped from someone at a nearby table. Ari's eyes lit up, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. She didn't need him to be perfect. She just wanted to be seen. Then she said softly, "You could change that." He nodded. Not as a billionaire. Not as a brand. Just as a man who had finally heard something true. And in that instant, everything he thought he knew about giving, began to unravel. Landon rose to his feet slowly, still clutching Ari's drawing like it was more valuable than any stock certificate he'd ever signed. His eyes scanned the room, the perfectly dressed guests, the high-ranking executives, the influencers hired to spread awareness. Suddenly, it all looked like a set. A stage. And he wasn't sure he wanted to play the part anymore. He cleared his throat. "I'd like to say something," he announced, interrupting the string quartet mid-song. The microphone his assistant handed him shook slightly in his hand. Tonight was supposed to be about a new campaign. A push to raise visibility, improve access, all the buzzwords we love. He glanced down at Ari, standing bravely by his side. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, and yet she looked like the only one in the room who truly belonged. "But I just realized, none of that means anything if we're still ignoring the most obvious truth." He turned to the crowd. "She asked me a simple question, why do people like me never get to eat in places like this? And I couldn't answer her." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some leaned forward. Others stiffened. He continued. "We don't need more polished speeches or shiny pledges. We need to start opening the doors, not for headlines, but for people who've been kept out without ever being told why." Landon paused, emotion creeping into his voice. "I'm not proud of how long it took for me to see it. But tonight, this little girl did what no boardroom, think tank, or advisor ever could. She showed me the truth." He handed the microphone back to his assistant, then did something no one expected. He pulled out his chair and offered it to Ari. The room froze. Landon Cross, the man whose table no one approached without an invitation, had just offered his seat to a little girl in a threadbare coat. The same chair meant for senators, CEOs, and foreign dignitaries was now waiting for someone who had walked in with nothing but a drawing and a question. Ari looked up at him, unsure. "Can I really?" He smiled warmly. "You already did more than anyone else in this room." Slowly, she climbed onto the chair. Her feet didn't reach the floor, and the table settings looked oversized in front of her. But she sat tall, like she belonged there all along. A silence settled over the restaurant, not awkward, not forced. Just, real. Landon turned to his staff. "Bring her mom here. Tonight. No cameras. No press release. Just dinner." The PR team panicked. "But Mr. Cross, the mayor's arriving in 20 minutes, I said what I said," Landon interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "This table has enough room." Then he looked back at Ari. "What would you order, if you could have anything?" She lit up. "Pancakes." Someone laughed nervously. Landon nodded. "Then bring her pancakes. Make them good. And tell the chef they don't need to look expensive, they just need to taste like home." Across the room, guests began putting down their glasses. A few looked uncomfortable. 1 or 2 stood up and walked out quietly. But others stayed. Watching. Thinking. For the first time in years, the night wasn't about appearances. It was about listening. And it had taken a child to make that happen. The waitstaff scrambled behind the scenes, not to serve champagne or caviar, but to fulfill an order no one had ever made in that restaurant before, pancakes. Ari giggled when the plate was placed in front of her. Fluffy, golden, stacked high with strawberries and syrup. A tiny scoop of butter slowly melting on top. It wasn't on the menu. But it didn't need to be. She took a bite and let out a quiet the kind that made Landon smile in a way he hadn't in years. Then the elevator dinged. A woman stepped into the room, tired eyes, work apron still tied around her waist, and confusion all over her face. It was Ari's mom. She froze when she saw the scene, her daughter sitting at a billionaire's table, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and tuxedoed servers. "Ma!" Ari called out, waving. Landon stood and approached her. "You must be her mother," he said gently. "I'm Landon Cross. Thank you for raising someone with more honesty than most rooms full of executives." She blinked, unsure whether this was real. I'm sorry if she interrupted anything, he shook his head. She saved it. He guided her to the seat beside Ari. At first, she resisted, awkward and stunned. But Ari reached for her hand and whispered, "He said we can eat here. Just us." The mother's eyes welled with tears. For a moment, Landon stepped back and simply watched. The billionaire didn't speak. He didn't pose for cameras. He just let them eat. Quietly. Together. And as the room settled again, something shifted. Other guests began waving over their servers, asking for pancake orders too. It started as a quiet ripple. Then a wave. Then a message. Within 20 minutes, the elegant rooftop, once a display of gold-trimmed menus and silent judgments, had transformed into something unrecognizable. Pancakes. Everywhere. At first, it looked absurd, suits and gowns, forks slicing through syrupy stacks, strawberries replacing lobster tails. But something about it felt healing. Not a publicity stunt. Not a trend. Just people remembering how to be human. Ari looked around, eyes wide. Are they copying me? Landon laughed. They're following your lead. Her mom, still dazed, leaned toward him. Why are you doing this? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the city skyline. I built this place to feel untouchable. Tonight, she reminded me why that's the problem. He turned back to her. I've spent millions trying to make change. But I never once sat down and listened to someone who lived it. Until now. Ari's mom softened, her eyes brimming with something more powerful than gratitude, understanding. This is more than dinner, she said. Landon nodded. It's a start. Meanwhile, one of the reporters, who had been quietly recording from her seat, stood up and cleared her throat. I was sent here to cover a billionaire's campaign launch, she said aloud, catching everyone's attention. But I think the real story is how a little girl with a drawing taught us all what equality really looks like. Everyone clapped. Not because they were told to. Not because a PR team directed it. But because they meant it. Ari beamed. She didn't fully understand the weight of what was happening. But she knew, somehow, she had changed something. And Landon? For the first time, he didn't feel like the richest man in the room. He felt humbled. And more alive than ever before. As the evening rolled on, the tone of the event shifted entirely. Gone were the stiff handshakes and rehearsed speeches. Gone were the smug glances from donors tallying their public goodwill. Instead, laughter floated over the clinking of forks and the scent of butter and syrup. And at the center of it all sat Ari, her plate half finished, her eyes glowing. She didn't realize it yet, but her question had opened more than a conversation. It had cracked open a system. Landon stood near the balcony, watching quietly as his guests, once untouchable titans of industry, leaned forward in their chairs, genuinely talking to the staff, asking questions, listening without filters. His phone buzzed. It was his communications director. CNN wants an exclusive. Do we confirm? He stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, no cameras. No spin. Just let it breathe. He turned to Ari and her mom, now deep in conversation with one of the chefs, who had come out to thank them for reminding him why he started cooking in the first place. Then something unexpected happened. One of the wealthiest guests in the room, a venture capitalist known more for cold mergers than warm gestures, stood up and cleared his throat. I'd like to cover the cost of this family's dinner tonight, he said. Ari's mom looked shocked. Before she could respond, another guest stood up. And I'll match a donation to her mom's business, whatever she needs to grow it. The room stirred. Ari looked up, confused. What's happening? Landon walked over and kneeled beside her again. They're trying to do what you did, he said. See someone. Ari tilted her head. But I didn't do anything big. Landon smiled softly. That's the point. You told the truth. And that's bigger than you know. Her mom reached over and gently tucked a curl behind Ari's ear, still overwhelmed. I've spent years trying to give her more than I had. And all this time, I thought I was invisible. Tonight, you reminded me I'm not. At that moment, Landon's assistant whispered something in his ear. The mayor had arrived downstairs, waiting to be introduced. Landon shook his head. Let him wait. He returned to Ari and her mom. Would you both join me at every meeting I host for this campaign moving forward? The mother blinked. What? You've lived what we pretend to understand. If this campaign is going to mean anything, it needs your voice more than mine. I'm not a politician, she said cautiously. Exactly, he replied. That's why I trust you. Ari tugged at his sleeve. Will there be pancakes? He grinned. I'll make it a rule. The restaurant erupted in laughter. Genuine, unfiltered, human. Something that couldn't be bought or choreographed. Meanwhile, the chef reappeared with a small tray. On it sat a new menu, hand-drawn in crayon. Laminated. Simple. Ari's special, pancakes with strawberries. No judgments allowed. They presented it to her like a trophy. Ari squealed with joy. Guests clapped again. And for the first time, the restaurant's towering glass walls didn't feel like barriers. They felt like windows, finally opened. Landon looked out once more at the city, now shimmering under the stars. He had started the night chasing headlines. But he was ending it chasing something far more important, change that starts with listening. The next morning, the world woke up to something different. No headlines screamed about a billionaire's flashy gala or another promise to solve inequality. Instead, a single photo had gone viral, shared not by media outlets, but by the staff and guests who had been there. It showed Ari sitting proudly at Landon Cross's private table, grinning over a plate of syrup-covered pancakes. Her crayon menu was front and center. No logos. No branding. Just truth. The caption that spread fastest read, "She didn't ask for money. She asked to matter." The image caught fire. By noon, hashtags like hashtag Ari was right, hashtag pancake policy, and hashtag open the table were trending globally. Talk shows replayed snippets of shaky phone footage from the rooftop. Not of Landon's speech, but of Ari asking her quiet, devastating question. Influencers, politicians, and even celebrities began posting their own versions of Ari's specials, holding pancake breakfasts in schools, shelters, and community centers. But Landon? He stayed quiet. No interviews. No press tour. No credit claimed. He was busy. Because that very morning, he'd walked into his corporate boardroom with something under his arm, the laminated copy of Ari's menu. He placed it in the center of the table and said, "This is our new starting point. No more initiatives written without the people they're supposed to serve." Executives looked puzzled. Landon didn't wait. He unveiled a new program, one that shifted funding from awareness campaigns to direct neighborhood investments. No middlemen. No filters. Just action. The boardroom fell silent. Then one by one, heads began to nod. Ari, meanwhile, was at school, unaware that her drawing now hung in 100 offices around the world. Weeks passed. The buzz around "the girl with the pancakes" didn't fade, it grew. But unlike other viral moments, this one didn't burn out. It built. Restaurants across the country began adopting Ari's table nights, reserved spaces where no reservations, dress codes, or status were required. Just a warm meal, a welcoming seat, and a promise to listen. Schools started using her story in classrooms to teach empathy, courage, and the power of asking honest questions. And Landon? He didn't go back to who he was before. He couldn't. He traded his photo ops for town halls. His private jets for neighborhood centers. His speeches for conversations, real ones, with people whose names weren't printed on donor walls. He brought Ari and her mom along every step of the way, not as symbols, but as advisors. Partners. At one televised event, a journalist asked Ari if she understood just how much she had changed. Ari thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I just wanted to eat pancakes with my mom," she said. The crowd laughed, but Landon's eyes brimmed with emotion. Because that simple desire, to sit at the table, to be seen, to share a meal without being judged, had accomplished what no billion-dollar campaign ever had. It had shaken the foundation of privilege, not with rage, but with grace. And it had reminded the world of a truth too often forgotten: sometimes, the smallest voice in the room carries the most power. And sometimes, all it takes to destroy a system built on silence is one brave little girl who dares to ask why. Months later, on a chilly autumn morning, Ari sat at a small table in the very same rooftop restaurant where it all began, but this time, it wasn't a one-time gesture. It was hers. The owners had officially renamed the section near the window Ari's Corner. A plaque on the wall read, "For the one who reminded us to make room." She was there with her mom, eating pancakes, still her favorite. Landon joined them too, wearing a simple jacket and carrying no entourage. They talked about school, not politics. About dreams, not funding proposals. Ari wanted to write books now. About people who feel invisible, she said. Landon had started reading more, books he'd ignored before. He told her that. "You changed me," he admitted. Ari looked up from her plate. "You changed too." He laughed. "That's fair." Suddenly, a timid boy from another table walked over, holding a sketchpad. "Are you the girl from the pancakes?" Ari smiled shyly. "Yeah." He looked down. "Can I sit with you?" Without missing a beat, Ari scooted over and patted the seat beside her. "Of course," she said. "There's always room." And just like that, no cameras, no applause, the cycle continued. Ari hadn't just changed a man. She had started a quiet revolution. One question. One drawing. One seat at the table. That's all it took. And in the end, it wasn't about charity, or headlines, or grand gestures. It was about the courage to see someone, and the grace to make space. Forever. Years later, long after the headlines had faded and the hashtags had been replaced by the next trend, the impact of that one evening still echoed. Ari was no longer the shy little girl with the crayon drawing. She had grown. Confident. Focused. And deeply committed to one simple idea, that everyone deserves a seat at the table. She had started her own foundation, the Table Project, aimed at supporting kids from overlooked communities through storytelling, art, and access to safe spaces. But it wasn't named after her. It was named after her mother, because Ari never forgot who showed her how to dream through struggle. Landon Cross retired from the corporate world not with a press conference, but with a handwritten note pinned to the door of his office. It read, "The best decision I ever made wasn't in a boardroom, it was pulling out a chair for someone I never noticed before." He spent his final years quietly funding initiatives led by the communities he used to speak about. No spotlights. No speeches. Just service. Every year, on the anniversary of that rooftop dinner, Ari returned to Ari's Corner, now a permanent fixture in the restaurant. The chef always made her pancakes, just like the first time. And every year, someone new would walk up to her. A quiet kid. A tired parent. A stranger looking for hope. And every time, she'd smile and slide a chair out with those same 4 words, "There's always room here." Because that was the legacy. Not money. Not fame. Not status. Just a question that opened the door, and a girl who never let it close again.